to the Liberty Podcast with Clint Armitage. We are proclaiming liberty one show at a time, and the next one starts right now. How's it going, everybody? Clint Armitage, Liberty Podcast. Thanks for joining us back here again today. So we're on the 5th episode of the Dark Ages of America, and this is going to be wrapping up the parallel, quote unquote, the parallel portion of the Dark Ages of America. We're going to continue Dark Ages of America episodes, but this is a culmination of the parallel. We're going to talk about the evidence. We're going to talk about how it connects, and then you take that, you do your own research, and then you make a decision whether or not you see the same thing that I do about what's happening in America, and is there a parallel to ancient Israel? We're going to find out right now. Let's do this. All right. So in this episode, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about, again, where the parallel of Israel and America was put into place and why we're starting to see the matching pattern now between these two nations. And again, you can do your own research and make your own decision whether or not you see the same thing. Now, let's do a recap. So there were 3 stages that I had mentioned in the previous episodes. These stages occurred first with the nation of Israel. And then you can decide for yourself if you see these same stages happening in America. Now, if you remember, the first stage was where Israel's leadership, even though they were fallible and they made a lot of mistakes, during their monarchy, having one leader, but they were still one nation under God. And that was the first stage of this. They were still one nation under God. Then stage 2 was when the nation split into 2 different kingdoms. Now, after the split, there was a northern kingdom. It was named Israel. And there was a southern kingdom named Judah. After both kingdoms, separated, they started to move away from God, and idolatry became rampant. It was like the apostasy was happening here. Okay? And now, after that was a second stage there, after the split. Now, the third stage was when King Ahab came to power in the northern kingdom of Israel. This was like the Dark Ages, like it ushered in the Dark Ages when he came into power with his super wicked wife, Jezebel. All right? And so it changed the spiritual nature of the nation, the spiritual culture, the way that they connected with God, because what they were doing was a big apostasy, right? It was moving away from God, and it really accelerated during this time. Okay? And again, he was ruling with his wife, and his wife actually had a lot to do with it too. And that's the stage 3, where I call the Dark Ages of Israel. Now, the Dark Ages of Israel, again, like I said, it was a huge decline in spiritual connection with the Lord. Okay? They really were intentionally turning what was good into evil and what was evil into good. Now, during these Dark Ages, Ahab thrusted idolatry into the mainstream. He made idol worship into a governmentally supported and nationally accepted occurrence. Now, the government was now endorsing and openly encouraged the people to participate in idol worship, which at that time, it included child sacrifice and sexual immorality. And the main idol was Baal. Okay, Baal. He was the main idol, and he was a pagan god, and he was all about sexual promiscuity. He was about everything sexuality, and also about prosperity and materialism. That's what it was. And again, it included child sacrifice. Okay? So pagan fertility and prosperity. He was that god, and he was the number one kind of pagan god at the time, taking the place of the Lord, because they were moving away from the Lord, pushing the Lord out of the public square, and now replacing it with Baal. And Ahab and Jezebel was the main reason for this. Baal became, or the pagan worship of Baal became the national religion of the northern kingdom. And because of this incredibly wicked, behavior from Ahab and also the other northern kingdom leaders, Israel was destroyed. And this happened in 722 BC by the Assyrians. The Assyrians came and just destroyed the northern kingdom. God allowed this because of all the idolatry, and he warned them multiple times. He warned both nations, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Okay, so now the southern kingdom, they held off for a little longer. And that's mainly because they actually had a handful of good kings that were able to suppress the growing idolatry in Judah for a time. Now, most of these good kings, quote unquote good kings, they did some good, but a lot of them didn't take away the high places. And the high places were a place where idolatry was kind of happening. So although they were for God and they did things for God and they removed some things, a good amount of these good kings did not get rid of the high places. So there was still some idolatry. And then when there wasn't a good king in place, in power, then idolatry really permeated into the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, there was, like I said, there was about a handful of good kings during that time in the southern kingdom, but there was like double the amount of wicked kings. So, and they really promoted idol worship just like Ahab did. But Ahab really set it off and really created the Dark Ages, and then it kind of came and covered and permeated through the southern kingdom after Ahab really did that. And as a matter of fact, one of the southern kings even married, one of his wives was from the northern kingdom, which also expanded the practice of idolatry. And it kind of continued to let it seep into the southern kingdom. So sexual ideology, promiscuity, financial prosperity, child sacrifice, all of that kind of stuff from the pagan god Baal eventually overtook Judah, just like it did for Israel, the northern kingdom. So what happened was the southern kingdom was finally destroyed too in 586 BC by the Babylonians. And it was because of their sins and apostasy from God, just like the northern kingdom. It just took them a little longer to get there, but they got there. So God allowed both kingdoms to be destroyed. And the destruction came after the acceleration of idol worship during the third stage, the Dark Ages, right? And I call it the Dark Ages of Israel. So the overarching question in all of this is whether or not America is following this same pattern. For instance, was America founded on godly and biblical principles just like Israel? Was America at one time one nation under God just like Israel? And is America splitting into two just like Israel? And finally, will there be an American leader that will usher this nation into the Dark Ages of what I like to call the Dark Ages of America? We don't know. But do we see the signs? Is it moving that way? Is God allowing us? Is the same kind of pattern happening like it did in Israel? And we know what happened to Israel. Can we make those connections? You'll have to research yourself and find out, but I'm kind of thinking we're heading in that direction. I believe it. So you make your decision on the facts, on what you find out. So in order to kind of find out and get more information about this, we're going to have to go back to the beginning, and let's see if there is a connection. Okay? So now what we're going to do is we're going to start discussing America's original covenant with God and how we were founded as a nation. Israel had a covenant with God as well. Moses said it before they actually came over into the promised land. Moses gave the covenant, and we'll talk about that later on. So what I was doing, I was reading a news article by CBN, and there was a journalist by the name of Paul Strand. He wrote an article dated July 1st of this year. Now, the article is entitled, America's Explicit Covenant with God, How a Nation Pledged to God Can Save a World or Lose It. All right? Now, that article was right on, man. It's 100% correct. We do have a covenant with God. And now we don't know which ways it's going to go, though. Because are we actually saving this world and sticking with our covenant with God, or are we losing it because we're going away from God and doing the same thing as Israel and Judah did with the apostasy? Okay, and they finally got destroyed. So the question is, are we holding up our end of this covenant with God? Right now, I don't think so. And our nation is continuing to backslide. I think we're continuing to move away from God at an accelerated rate. Just like you saw with the information and the episodes that I talked about before with Israel's movement away from God, they started to accelerate, especially during Ahab's reign. Now, you saw some of that happening before Ahab, but then when Ahab's reign came in, it hit. And we didn't get into all of Ahab's exploits and all that stuff, but go ahead and read through it and you'll see that it exploded. Idolatry exploded during Ahab's reign, which is the Dark Ages, that I'm calling the Dark Ages, okay? So there was an accelerated rate. I think America is also accelerating. We've accelerated for a few years now, maybe from the late 80s, in the 90s, until now. Now, there's an author that was quoted in that article on CBN. His name is Dutch Sheets. He puts it like this. He says, quote, "We used to be the number one exporter of the gospel, but now we are the number one exporter of pornography," unquote. That's acceleration. Going from the number one exporter of the gospel to the number one exporter of pornography, that is an accelerated rate. That has to have changed. I mean, that change happened pretty darn fast. It's only been, 40 years? Less than that? 30-something years? It's moving fast. So if that's true, if you believe that like I do, then we're in dire straits right now. We're in trouble. The apostasy is accelerating in America. Now, also in the article is U.S. historian David Barton of wallbuilders.com. He asked the following question, quote, "The average length of a constitution in the history of the world is 17 years. So how have we gone 230 when everyone else was only going 17? And so political science professors looked to see where the founders got their ideas, our founders, our fathers, our founding fathers. Now, Barton says that 34% of the founders' quotes in all the original political documents and etc., all the stuff that was part of the foundation of our government came from the Bible. Now, if you 34%, that is 1/3 majority of the founders' official political writings came from the Bible. So to me, the answer is pretty clear. Our founding fathers infused God's wisdom into our nation's founding. And that's why our Constitution has lasted the test of time, I think, because God's words and his ways are eternal. However, this is the problem. As we start to overturn, disregard, or circumvent our founders' writings and our Constitution, which is basically God's laws and God's ways, our nation's going to continue to move towards disharmony, rebellion, and chaos. And this includes war. We already had one civil war. Are we going to have another? I don't know about that, but there are going to be some wars if we don't change our ways. Now, it could be wars with other nations, but war is going to be something in the future. It's already written. We just don't know who it includes. Does it include America? Well, I'll talk more about that in another episode, about the potential for war and the other last days, end time events that's actually recorded in the Bible, and it's reported by Jesus. But first, what I want to do is I want to continue talking about our nation's covenant with God here. See, we forget and we don't make mention of the curses that are attached to our covenant with God. Just like the parallel with Israel. See, just like Israel, God's covenant with the nation comes with conditions. One main condition, and that condition is to continue to follow God and his ways wholeheartedly. You saw that in the other episodes when I talked about Jeroboam. When Jeroboam was given the 10 tribes, God gave him a condition. You have to follow me wholeheartedly and you will be blessed, is what he said. But Jeroboam did not. And he started the whole idol worship thing with these golden calves and these altars, the 2 altars in Bethel and Dan. That was the beginning of it, right? That was right after the split. That was in stage 2. So that's the condition, is to follow God and his ways wholeheartedly. then God's going to bless the nation. But if the nation doesn't continue to follow God, like Jeroboam and all the northern kingdom and then eventually the southern kingdom, he's going to remove his blessing, okay? And the nation could be subjected to a curse. He's definitely going to be removing the hedge of protection. He's going to be removing the blessing. And the leadership of the country is going to be the responsible ones for its direction. The leadership of a country is also responsible for upholding the original covenant of the nation. Now, Moses gave the original covenant for Israel, but the kings of Israel and Judah did not uphold the covenant that was laid out and proclaimed by Moses. And so God allowed that nation to be destroyed, both of them, both kingdoms. So again, the leadership of a country is responsible for upholding the original covenant of that nation. All right, unfortunately, we're going to have to stop right there. And it looks like this is episode 5.1, and we're going to have episode 5.2 next time, because we're already going up onto the max of our time here. So I appreciate you coming by. Listen up for the next episode, 5.2, and we're going to finish off this parallel and wrap everything together on the Dark Ages of America. Until next time, stay safe, stay motivated, and keep seeking liberty. For joining us for another episode of the Liberty Podcast with Clint Armitage. If you want to get in touch, email us at info@clintarmitage.com.